Buongiorno, Hannah.
Buongiorno.
Welcome to Pause It For Me, episode 23. That's the third episode in season 2. Today, we're going to be talking about the jazz singer. In the last episode, I said that we were going to be talking about the Passion of Joan of Arc, which was in fact wrong. I thought that came next because it was another silent film, and I was under the impression that the jazz singer was the first talkie. So I thought it came after Joan of Arc, but in fact, it came before Joan of Arc. But we may as well have just jumped right to Joan of Arc instead of watching this, because I don't want to talk about this for 45 minutes. I barely want to talk about it at all.
Not for 45 minutes. I think we'll chat about it a little bit, but I don't think this film is a masterpiece. I think there's a reason we had trouble finding it and it was hard to come by, because I don't think it's lasted the test of time.
So we watched it on Tubi, which is an app on our Chromecast that gives you free movies with ads. That was the only place where I could find it, and I think that's for good reason.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Just to come right out with it, this film has a few pretty extended and uncomfortable portrayals of blackface.
Yeah.
And they're really hard to get through, and it really soured the movie for me.
Absolutely.
And as a result, I don't think this movie should be remembered. I don't want to put it on a pedestal. I don't even really want to talk about it, but we sat down and watched it for an hour and a half to record a podcast episode. So let's at least get out a few thoughts before we just move on to other stuff that we've watched.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, you can't really cut it out because he's wearing blackface for multiple scenes, and it's like pivotal scenes to the movie.
Unfortunately. I mean, the story wasn't even that good to begin with. It was fine. It was passable. But by the time we got to those scenes, I was skipping ahead because I just didn't want to watch it.
It's a pretty basic story, and maybe at the time it wasn't trite in 1927, but even then I don't even know, because it feels like a story as old as time, where it's like a kid wants to do something and their parent is disapproving, but then they do it anyways, but then they reconcile in the end. I feel like even Shakespeare did that. So I don't know, like it's fine, it's relatable to some degree, because you know, kids always want to do stuff different than their parents, but it's also like, I don't know. It's not like majorly compelling. You kind of know in the end they're going to reconcile. Otherwise, why are you doing this? I don't know.
Yeah. So a couple just quick thoughts just to get through it. It was based on a play.
Oh, okay.
There were many jump cuts.
Yeah.
Breathless, you're not special.
But these were like, they weren't doing it like for some kind of artistic flair, quote unquote. Like they weren't jumping the scenes. They were just like pretending that there was no cuts, even though it was pretty obvious that there was.
It was pretty crappy.
And well, they used it in such a stupid way, because it was like the way that they put the jump cuts in, they could have just not included the cut, because it was usually just like an extended reaction of something that was happening. And it was like, you could have just cut it off there. I
think what they did was they either took maybe like 3 takes of a certain action and then put all 3 takes back to back to back to try and act like the action was longer. Or maybe they just use the same take 3 times in a row to try and extend it. Which, if you're going to do that, do it the Star Wars Tusken Raider way, where you play the clip forward motion and then play it reverse motion and then forward motion again.
So it looks like it's a movement. Yeah.
Exactly.
Whereas like, but it's like, it's a silent film. And it's just like, why do you want to stay on one shot of no one saying anything? Like, it just doesn't make sense.
And
I don't know.
To begin with, I was pretty disappointed that it was basically still a silent film.
Yeah.
And it not a very good one at that, because like the text barely stayed on screen long enough to read, except for the parts where it stayed on screen so long that I had time to read it like 3 times. And I'm like, okay, I read it. I get it. Cut back to the scene.
I'm thinking it was like the text on the screen was the same length of time regardless of how much text was on the screen. So if it was a shorter sentence, then it was easy to read it a couple times. But if it was like a long paragraph, you're like, oh, okay, well, whatever.
Well, whatever, indeed. Speaking of well, whatever, I think somebody in the apartment right next to us is doing their laundry. So if you hear that, that's what that is. But in comparison to Metropolis, I felt like there was too much text. You know, Metropolis left a lot unspoken. You could tell what was going on by the reactions of
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
actors. This just spelled it out most of the time.
Completely. And I felt like in Metropolis, they gave the characters like interesting facial expressions. Like especially the female lead in Metropolis, she had some like really wacky faces that I thought were hilarious. But in this, it was just kind of like, oh, I'm sad, I'm staring. Oh, whatever. It's
Yeah.
like kind of blah.
It was quite blah.
But yeah, as we were saying, we were under the impression that this was the first talkie, whereas more it's like they were experimenting. It was like bridging the gap between silent to full sound,
Right.
where they had like some singing. And it was like, okay. Like for the first few minutes, there was no sound at all. And I was like, I thought this was a talkie. And then like a second later, the characters started to sing and it was out of sync. And
Very
I was
poorly
like,
synced,
oh,
yeah.
great. Like they synced it up okay for some of the songs, but like the kid in the beginning, he was just literally just flapping his mouth, and it felt like a really poor dub of like an anime or something. Like
And it was clearly like a grown woman singing and not a kid. You could tell.
it didn't sound like the kid at all.
No. So what IMDb calls this is the first feature-length movie with audible dialogue, which, yes, okay, I guess that's true. You want to know what I thought they were going to do? I thought they were going to pull a Wizard of Oz, where everything when he was a kid was shot as if it was a silent movie.
Yeah.
And then when they do the flash forward to him being an adult, suddenly it's full sound.
That would have been awesome,
Yeah.
honestly.
Like what the Wizard of Oz does, where the beginning part is like sepia tone, black and white, sort of. And then they have the transition into full color. It's amazing.
It's so beautiful.
And I thought, I was predicting that might happen. And then when they flash forward and you could hear the sounds of the forks and knives and plates clattering, I was like, oh, they did it. We're in full sound now. And no.
No, they just did it for
like
that effect.
Yeah.
It was weird though, because that would have been awesome. It was like, okay, like now that he's left his father, he can like find his voice, like quote unquote, and like he comes alive. Like that would have been so cool, but I don't know.
Right. And just like comparing it again to Metropolis, which I felt was a great silent movie, even the aesthetic of the title cards was piss poor. Like with the Warner Brothers logo constantly in the bottom right. Like why? Why is that
like,
need to
are
be
we
there?
watching a TV show?
Yeah.
It was weird because Metropolis came out at the same year, right?
I think so. I think IMDb said 1927. I think Tubi said 1928. It's a little all over the place, but they were basically around the same time.
Well, you could tell Metropolis had like a super high budget, and it was like sort of a blockbuster of its day, and this was kind of just like
whatever.
Mid-budget maybe.
Yeah. So I'm not even gonna rate it. Just don't watch it. I wouldn't recommend it.
I don't think it's worth it. Like the female costuming like of the young actress was good. That's one of the few noteworthy things. The mother, in terms of silent acting, she gave a somewhat believable performance, because in silent acting it's usually a bit over the top because there's no dialogue, but I felt it was maybe a little bit grounded and I thought she did a good job. I don't know.
Is my reaction as well.
I would say it's akin to like black and white versus color films, or like 1080p versus 4K, or the transition between analog film to digital, whereas it's like, yeah, maybe this is one of the first audible dialogue movies, but
that doesn't mean it's worth watching.
It's like it was in a transition period where it's like, we are gonna have good silent film still, but we're also gonna have like talkies come up, but it's gonna take a while before like everything becomes talkie.
Right.
Same with color films. Like there was black and white films up until like the 60s, and then in the 70s it was like predominantly color from then on.
If you're interested in the transition from silent films to talking films, don't watch this movie. Watch Singin' in the Rain. That's like actually a fictionalized account of a studio trying to transition, but it's so much more entertaining than this.
Yeah, because they did it in a really compelling way, like showing the production trials and error of like getting actors and actresses to like talk into a mic, and they weren't used to doing that, and they didn't really know about good mic placement back then, so they would put it like far away, and they would just be like moving their face, and it would be like not picking it up, like
yeah, like facing over here and trying to talk into the microphone, and then facing over here.
Yeah,
I highly recommend that movie. Good movie.
It's a great movie
with no blackface, as far as I can remember.
And the musical numbers are mostly good. There's one extended musical section that I'm like, this is good, but it's like going on far too long, where it's like the guy's like, gotta dance, and it's like a 10-minute sequence.
I think that's like one of the more famous parts of that movie, and I feel like if you cut it out, the movie would be much better.
I just think it's good, but it ruins the pacing of the rest of the movie because it's like a dream sequence, so it's not really related.
Just to clarify, I think Gotta Dance is not the song in the dream sequence.
Well, it's like a ballerina and everything. Yeah.
We're talking about the dream sequence that's like 2/3 of the way through the movie. That you can cut out. I think if Gotta Dance comes earlier in the film, I don't know.
I think it's like this huge dream sequence of like Hollywood figuring out. Anyways, we're getting off on a tangent.
It's been a while since we've seen that. So
because of this movie's like, nah.
We tend to do that with movies that we don't like. Instead of focusing on why we don't like it, just talk about something else that we do like.
You know, there's really not much to say about this movie. It's like, you know, tale as old as time, religious parents not understanding their kids like wanting to do something that's different than tradition. It's like, okay.
Those kind of movies are probably going to continue to get made forever.
Yeah, and I think there's interesting ways to do that if it comes from the heart. Like I would say Shiva Baby is a pretty good example of a modern equivalent of, you know, a Jewish girl, you know, maybe straying from the traditions of her parents, and she's at like a Shiva. I don't know.
Right. Well, to wrap up our discussion on the jazz singer, it's time for our one and only recurring segment on the podcast. Gabe's grades. So here's what our podcast friend Gabe from Carl and Gabe Go to the Movies thought about the jazz singer. 2.5 stars out of 5.
That's pretty generous.
It's very generous. I was curious why clips from the first talking picture don't really get used all that much in historical montages. Then I got to the hour mark and said, oh, that's why.
Yep.
This isn't really a true talkie, and the singing isn't even that good. Just a new technology being used as a stunt to draw in an audience to watch an otherwise mediocre story. Pretty much.
I totally agree. Like, I'm assuming it's probably the same with the first color pictures.
Yeah, which, now that we're talking about that, I want to look up to see what the first color movie was.
Yeah, because I would say that The Wizard of Oz is one of the more famous movies to come out in color. I think that came out in the early 40s. And obviously, there was still, as I said, there was black and white movies kind of sporadically, you know, after that, but from like the late 40s, 50s on, we started to see more color films. So I wonder what the first one is. It probably would have been painted in color, not like true color. So I don't know.
Any other final thoughts about the jazz singer before we move on to more fun topics?
No, I don't know. I mean, I like silent films enough. I think Nosferatu is pretty cool. Metropolis is worth a watch for sure. This, not so much. I'm excited to see The Passion of the Joan of Arc.
Sorry, I think you got the title wrong. It's The Passion of the Joan of the Arc.
Isn't that what I said? I don't know.
You got it completely wrong. How dare you?
Yeah, so I'm excited to see that because I've heard good things about that. So I'm enjoying that. And then I'm excited to get to the more prominent talkies, like Citizen Kane, I think is the 1940s. So once we get to that, actually, I think cinema is gonna get a lot better, and I'm so much more excited for those type of movies.
Yeah, well, I think our Joan of Arc episode is going to be a pretty cool one because we've been eager to get Gabe on the podcast as a guest star for a little bit, and I asked him what from our upcoming list of movies he was interested to talk about, and he actually asked to talk about The Passion of the Joan of the Arc.
Yeah.
Which I was interested in because I've never heard him talk about it, so I didn't know that he felt strongly about it. But he completely passed on the jazz singer. He was like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't know anything
honestly, understandably so. So if he thinks it's good enough to talk about, I'm excited to talk about Joan of Arc.
Right.
So
and I avoided looking at his Letterboxd review because I don't want to spoil it for myself.
yeah. And then coming up to the 1940s, I'm quite excited because that's where I start to get more interested in the cinema of that time. Like, we recently saw a 1940s movie, Rebecca, one of Hitchcock's first, I think.
Right.
Well, one of his more prominent ones.
Much earlier. It was
Yeah.
one of his prominent ones that's much earlier than his other prominent ones. Because interestingly, like Psycho and The Birds and those color ones that he's pretty famous for happened rather late in his career. And if you scroll back, he had so many movies before that.
He did. I think he more or less rose to prominence in the American cinema scene 1940s on. I would say that Rebecca, as far as I know, is one of his first big hits. And then after that, he had like a bunch of heavy hitters. But I believe I wrote like an essay where he had made some like silent film about some guy that I was studying for my vampire class.
Pardon me.
For my vampire class, I had to write an essay about one of Bram Stoker's closest friends. And I guess Hitchcock wrote like a silent film or made a silent film about one of Bram Stoker's besties.
Really?
So I don't know. So I think he had been working since the 1920s, but you know, he finally had like his big movies later on.
Okay, well, let's take the opportunity to talk about Rebecca a bit. So I've pulled up the log line here. Rebecca, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, came out in 1940. The log line is, a self-conscious woman juggles adjusting to her new role as an aristocrat's wife and avoiding being intimidated by his first wife's spectral presence.
See, that's not bad, but I feel like if I had read that log line, the first like half hour, an hour, I'd be like, what? That's not what this movie is about.
Yeah, let's get to it, you know?
That's kind of, I went into it not knowing really what it was about. Like, all I had heard was it's made by Hitchcock.
Yep.
And it's based on a famous murder mystery novel. And I was like, all right.
That
sounds like enough for me.
That's what you told me going in. And because I had never heard of it before. I never even heard of the title. So I was like, what is this?
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty into murder mystery. So I was trying to read some of the classics. And Rebecca is always on like the top lists for like best mystery thriller movies or books, rather.
Yeah. I was drawn in immediately because it stars Laurence Olivier, which is a name that I had heard so many times, but I'd never seen what he looked like. I'd never seen him in anything. And I thought it was quite good in this.
Yeah,
solid
I mean,
performance.
He's supposed to be like one of the most famous actors of all time. As I was saying, he's like I can't even remember his name again. He's like
the Daniel Day-Lewis of his time.
Yeah, he's the Daniel Day-Lewis of his time.
Yeah, once Daniel Day-Lewis retires, just his name just flutters out of our brains.
And I've seen him in enough things.
Yeah.
But he's always so different and becomes the character that I'm like, oh, he's Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yeah, so that was awesome. And he's the kind of, like, Laurence Olivier is the kind of actor that comes to my mind when I think of the word thespian, which, again, is funny because
100%.
I've never seen him in anything. But now I have,
Yeah.
and he was good.
We should watch the I Love Lucy episode where he's, like, in a play.
Laurence Olivier guest starred in I Love Lucy?
Yeah, and he's, like, an actor in a play.
Interesting. What season is that? I just happen to have the DVDs behind me.
I want to say it was one of the later seasons when they were doing, like, more gimmicky guest star things. Probably, like, season 6.
Well, you've been digging out the I Love Lucy DVDs recently because we also did a Superman marathon where we watched the Richard Donner original Superman starring Christopher Reeve from the 70s. And then we watched Superman 2. We didn't watch Man of Steel. We skipped that because I didn't feel
Apparently
like it was worth watching.
unwatchable or not.
It wasn't
great.
worth watching.
Yeah.
In my opinion. And then we watched Batman versus Superman, the Ultimate Edition. And then after that,
that was pretty good.
You pulled out the I Love Lucy DVDs and we watched the episode where George Reeves from the old Superman show guest starred.
It just felt very fitting because it was a different Superman. It was like actually the Superman like making an appearance. And also Lucy dresses up as Superman.
In like a crappy costume.
And it's pretty funny. Well, actually, that's what I like. There's some realism to that because
yeah, it's supposed to be crappy.
Often in TV shows, someone's wearing like a costume at a costume party and it's like awesome.
Like the holiday armadillo.
Yeah. It's like everyone has like elaborate costumes. Like, you know, Phoebe, she wears a Supergirl costume and it's like awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like if you're going to a costume party or you're dressing up in a costume, most of the time it looks crappy.
Yeah.
So I
It's like
felt like
I couldn't think of what to go as, so I just wrapped toilet paper around myself
I'm
before
a
I had it
mummy.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, so it felt realistic as Lucy said, like, I'm gonna pull together this costume so I can surprise my son. And like maybe if I zoom around the room fast enough, they won't notice that I'm not Superman.
That's so Raven move if I've ever heard one. That you can definitely see like Lucille Ball inspiration in the comedy of Raven.
100%, because it's the same sort of thing with Raven where she's like, I've got to do this thing, and the best way for me to do this is to dress up in an elaborate costume and put on like a crazy character.
Yeah.
And that's like Raven and same with Lucy. She's like, I gotta get out of this jam. I'm gonna dress up as an old man, and then the beard is gonna get stuck to my face and I have to walk around with a fake beard.
Totally. So about Superman specifically, we watched the original, which you said you've seen, and I've seen it a couple times, but not in a long time. Disappointed me a little bit.
It was honestly like, I remembered it being super boring the first time I saw it. And I was like pleasantly surprised that like I enjoyed it a bit.
A bit.
I wasn't like bored out of my skull.
Right. Seeing as I wrote a letterbox review for Superman, I'll just go ahead and read a couple parts of it. So here's what I wrote. I really wish this was a classic, but unfortunately it far from earns that title. This movie needs to be cut down a lot, probably by half at least. Way too much Krypton destruction, way too much fault line havoc. The explanation for Zod is completely unnecessary, and over an hour until we actually see Superman. Yada, yada, yada. Christopher Reeve does an excellent job, but unfortunately the writing makes the Superman more concerned with getting laid than with saving people. Not so super after all. So I guess I kind of went in with too high expectations.
I suppose so. I mean, in the 70s, we weren't as used to all the superhero movies. It wasn't like done to death where we knew exactly like, okay, these are the kind of effects we should do, and this is how we should do this character and everything.
It was so
it
slow.
was brand new.
They were milking Marlon Brando for all that he was worth, let me tell you.
And he's not worth much, honestly.
I mean, personally, I don't think he's worth much, especially in that role, but they paid him a lot.
But like, honestly, I haven't seen him in much thus far where I'm like, oh, he was amazing. He deserves a big salary and an Oscar. Like, even in The Godfather, he's not really the standout. It's Al Pacino.
I guess that's a matter of interpretation.
What, do you really think that Marlon Brando was amazing in The Godfather?
I mean, he wasn't bad.
He wasn't bad.
But you know what? Like, coming up on our list way down the line is Apocalypse Now, which he's in. And we've both seen The Godfather Part 1, but we haven't seen Godfather Part 2. So I think we're going to roll those together.
Yeah, well, I don't think, is Marlon Brando in number 2? Because
that's actually a really good question.
And number 1, he dies.
Okay, spoilers for The Godfather.
Okay, one of the most famous movies of all time.
Yeah. Well, his character is in number 2.
Yeah.
But maybe not played by him.
I don't know. Isn't it played by Robert De Niro?
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for that because I like Robert De Niro.
Yeah. Well, you never know. Maybe there'll be flashbacks to Marlon Brando. But
that's true.
It's an interesting point. But at least when we rewatch Godfather Part 1, we'll be able to reevaluate his performance. But all that said, Superman 1, kind of disappointing. Superman 2, also surprisingly disappointing.
Yeah. I mean, and so on the tail of that, I think a lot of people at the time didn't like Batman versus Superman. But since I had just seen 2 very mediocre Superman movies, and then I went into that, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so much better. The effects are better. Like, the pacing is better somewhat. I mean, it's really long, but just overall, it was more interesting than the 1970s one, especially number 2. Superman number 2. The editing was horrendous.
And I don't know if it was just the version that we were watching, because like I couldn't believe it was that bad.
It was
like,
so bad.
A scene would end and the audio would just like cut out. The audio would stop as it faded into the next scene. The fade would complete and then the audio would cut back in. I was like, who looked over this?
Yeah. So I don't know if you saw my review on Letterboxd, but I said it was like a kid finding Windows Movie Maker for the first time.
That's a good one. I'll just read the end of my review. I said, I believe if you cut out half of the first movie, cut out half of the second movie, and weave them together into one film, you've got a damn good Superman movie in there somewhere. Too bad that's not how they chose to go about it. And I think kind of what I wrote there is a little bit what happened with the Richard Donner cut, where years later the original director re-edited it,
I'd be
much in the
interested to
same
see that.
vein
Yeah.
as Zack Snyder's Justice League, interestingly enough, which we
It's
have not
true.
seen. But overall, I yearned for more. And so Batman versus Superman, I saw the Ultimate Edition around when it first came out. And I remember people hating it. And I watched the Ultimate Edition and I couldn't understand. I was like, this movie's awesome. This movie kicks ass.
Yeah.
Like, what do you not like about it? And so a couple of years went by and I thought, maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe I was just like on a high from the movie and maybe it's not as good as I remember. So we sat down, we skipped Man of Steel, we watched Batman versus Superman, again, the Ultimate Edition. I have the Blu-ray, and I thought it completely slapped. I thought it was awesome.
Well, I think perspective is everything, because if you were the modern movie audience where you had just seen like the Dark Knight trilogy or something, and then you went into Batman versus Superman, I could see being like underwhelmed. But if you watch Superman 2 right before that, you're like, oh my gosh, this is a breath of fresh air.
That's very true. So again, I'll read a little bit from my review. Basically what I said was, this film is a veritable superhero epic with excellent action scenes, kick-ass music, and frameable cinematography. I mean, I literally like went back after the movie was over and I paused it at certain parts and I was like, oh, look how good this looks. I would put this on my wall. It's awesome.
Yeah, well, they actually drew inspiration from a bunch of comic panels, right? And I appreciate the attention to detail that they did all those homages.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I did was I went and grabbed my graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns, and flipped open to some pages and I was like, look, this is from that. They got it like from here.
And it was like 3 frames on the screen and you had to like pause it to get to like the exact moment of the cover.
Like right when the lightning strikes.
I appreciate that really attention to detail because they didn't even try to milk it. They're like, oh yeah, we're including this homage to this cover, but we're not even gonna settle on it.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
I thought it was awesome. If you've seen it and you didn't like it, I imagine maybe you saw the theatrical cut, which I have not seen, and I've heard it's not as good because it's like 30 minutes shorter. So if you didn't like it, I recommend the Ultimate Edition. If you've seen the Ultimate Edition and you still don't like it, you know what? Don't even tell me why. Yeah. I can imagine why someone wouldn't like it because, Superman doesn't really act that Superman-y. He's not nice. He's friendly. He's not the friendly neighborhood Superman.
I found him interesting, though, because he was kind of, emo, dark, and edgy, kind of like the Batman we've come to know today.
So I can understand why someone wouldn't like it if they set their expectations at a certain level and were not open to something different. But I think if you open your mind to interpretations of characters that aren't necessarily what they have been throughout history, you can find something to like in it.
Yeah, I liked it because sometimes Superman, even though I liked Christopher Reeve's performance, is like Superman in general, I just find to be a bit blah because he's such a do-gooder and so moral and sweet and nice that it doesn't feel super compelling.
Well, this is what I said to you. This was my take, is that because Superman is typically invulnerable to the acts of most villains, to me, the way to beat Superman isn't to kill him. The way to beat Superman is to prevent him from saving humanity.
Well, that's what they did in the second one.
Right.
Not super effectively.
The way to beat Batman is to beat him to a pulp. Like, whatever. Who cares, right? But, like, Superman is all about saving the planet, saving the Earth. So, in the first one, by shooting the missiles and trying to prevent him from capturing both missiles at the same time, that's the way to beat him, is like not to chain him to kryptonite in a pool and get him to drown, because he's just going to sit there until someone saves him, basically. Like, I don't think he's actually going to drown. But similar to what happens at the end of Man of Steel, the way to defeat Superman is to prevent him from saving destruction. So I think that's interesting because it's different from most superheroes, where you're concerned more so with the hero than what they're actually trying to do. That's my take.
I think they did that somewhat effectively in Batman versus Superman. Like Lex Luthor Jr. was like, I'm going to force you to attack Batman because you want to save your mom.
Yeah.
And it was like, it's not like he's making him do it for whatever reason. He gave him a moral dilemma where it's like, if you don't do this, then I'm gonna do this, instead of just like chaining him up.
Yeah. And I found that more interesting, especially
Definitely more interesting.
more interesting than taking a cellophane thing off of your chest and throwing it at the bearded man and having him get wrapped up. Like, what was with that?
I can't even wrap my mind around that. I'm not gonna. But I think moral dilemma is the best way to handle Superman, because he is supposed to be like, Lex Luthor said he's like God, Jesus, like he's kind of like that figurehead, like the savior of humanity, because he's like practically invincible.
Right.
It's like, if we're gonna get biblical, it's like Jesus wandering in the wilderness for 40 days and Satan is tempting him, being like, oh, you should eat food. Like, if you're really God, like, why don't you do this thing and prove that you're God? So that's the more interesting take on it with Lex Luthor, where it's like, yeah, you think you're all special, huh? Well, why don't you prove it and like make you do this thing? Whereas if it's just like a regular villain, it's like, we know Superman's gonna defeat him. Like, big deal. Like, who cares? I want to see Superman struggle. I want to see like differences. Otherwise, it's like, oh, great, he's happy, he's Superman. Like, I'm Superman, I saved the day. And it's like, that's
Bye.
That's not super interesting.
I got such a kick out of that in the Christopher Reeve one, where he just flies
really
away
funny.
and he's like, bye.
I love when characters do like a little wave, like, ha ha ha, I'm here.
Yeah.
Like Han Solo, when he like points to himself, he's like, me.
What I'm getting from your take is that we got to watch Smallville.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. But we're actually in the middle of a different superhero show. We're two superhero shows right now. We're watching through X-Men on Disney Plus from the 90s to prepare for the revival of the exact same show.
If it doesn't come out, I'm going to be mad. Because sometimes they hype things up and they're like, oh, we're coming back. And then they're like, no, we got canceled. Sorry.
Right. So we're watching through that, and we're dabbling in a few episodes of Spider-Man, because I just can't help myself. I love Spider-Man.
But that's what makes Spider-Man and X-Men so interesting, because it's all about the moral dilemmas. Like Spider-Man, it's about balancing his home life with his superhero life, and you see the humanity and how like it's hard for him to go back and forth and do both and balance both, especially as a young person. Whereas X-Men, it's about them being others and fighting for civil rights and like trying to get humanity on their board, and they're like gentle giants, and it's like they just want to do the right thing, but also they're human beings, so they're upset about the situation. They don't always react in the right way, and it's very compelling. Instead of just being like, yep, I'm perfect in every way, and I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna save a lady from falling off a building and then bye. I just don't find that as interesting.
I suppose. I mean, that we did watch a couple of episodes of the Superman show, also from the late 90s or maybe early 2000s. And I thought that was really solid. That was
the best interpretation I've seen of it thus far.
Yeah, I also gave that a Letterboxd review, because the first 3 episodes or maybe 4 episodes are compiled as Last Son of Krypton. So if you want to see my thoughts on that, check out my Letterboxd at Winesty, I guess, is my Letterboxd. And yours is
Hannah Brannon.
So that was solid, but I think Spider-Man and X-Men have some differences from, say, the Superman and the Batman show. I love the Batman show, but it's more about character with regards to the villains, I would say, and oftentimes Batman. And it's really less about saving the city or saving individual people in the Batman show.
Batman is usually less Bruce Banner focused and
Bruce
more
Banner.
like,
we talking about the Hulk?
Oh,
Hulk smash!
Sorry, Bruce Wayne.
Oh, Bruce Wayne. Yes, of course, Bruce Wayne.
It's usually like Bruce Wayne is like a means to an end. Like, we're explaining why Batman is like the way he is, whereas like he's basically mostly Batman. Whereas like Peter Parker feels very dual. Yeah. Like, it's very integral that he's swapping back and forth between Spidey and Peter and trying to balance that out. Whereas Bruce Wayne like has no family, has like mostly no friends. Like,
rub it in, why don't you?
Batman is like basically all he has.
Yeah, but that's part of it. That's still interesting. They're just interesting in 2 different ways.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. We just finished the Black Suit Spider-Man symbiote episodes.
Oh, those are always classic.
And I got so hyped about that. I think where X-Men is shining so far is in their backstory episodes.
Yeah.
Because when they try to do
saga was bad.
Yeah. When they try to do things that are too complicated, I just start to zone out and I'm like, who are these 5 characters that they introduced in the last 10 minutes? What are their names? I don't care. I want to know how Beast got to look like Beast. That's what I think
my
is
goodness,
cool.
the Beast episode where he falls in love with the human girl
who's
but
blind.
then they can't be together, but the blind girl loves him no matter what he looks like.
Yeah. The Rogue backstory episode was also great.
Yeah, all of them have been awesome, the backstory episodes. But those are like showcases of their humanity and why they have superpowers and what it means to them. Yeah. Whereas them going to space and like interacting with a bunch of crazy people is like, well, what's the humanity in that? I just feel like I'm watching like talking toys.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing what the revival has to offer, because I think they wouldn't bring it back unless they had something to say or something to do. Because I think the episodes that we've seen so far overall have been pretty messy.
But fun for the most part.
But fun, yeah. The Spider-Man episodes are I think fine-tuned a little bit better. I think they're slightly better written, both in terms of the story within an episode and the dialogue within an episode. I think they're doing it a little bit better, but it's a bit less exciting because there's only the one villain, or sorry, only the one hero.
Yeah, well, it's easy to focus on Peter Parker / Spidey because he's the main character, whereas X-Men, they have to balance like 10 different characters, and it's like, okay, here's the episode where this character really gets to shine. Whereas it's mostly an ensemble show that you have to balance, and you're like, all right, we have to give this character something to say. We have to give this character something to say. So it's a bit harder to balance that in the writing.
I'm definitely enjoying them, but I feel like what they're lacking is some of the subtlety of the Bruce Timm, Paul Dini DC shows. So Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series. I said this to you off mic that the Spider-Man show and the X-Men show have a lot of shared DNA.
Yeah. And
the Superman show and the Batman show have a lot of shared DNA. And not just because they're Marvel and DC and DC.
I think it's like similar teams.
Yeah, similar teams, similar vibes, similar energy.
Yeah.
But the 4 of them do not have shared shared DNA between them. Like the Superman show is not at all like the Spider-Man show. The Batman show is not at all like the X-Men show.
Yeah.
So different takes for different people. But it's nice that we're watching Spider-Man and X-Men at the same time. And maybe back in the day, I watched Superman and Batman at the same time. Because if we were going back and forth between X-Men and Batman, I think I would be drawing comparisons way too much in a bad way.
Apples and oranges. Like DC and Marvel just do different things with their characters.
Yeah. The Batman show, to me, is all of the kookiness from the villains of the 60s Adam West show, with all of the subtlety and the slow sort of character building that I gather is prevalent in the comics and graphic novels. So I think it's a really good balance of that, while combining all those in swashbuckling adventures that still reach an end, reaching conclusion by the end of the episode. And of course, Batman's villains have always outshined Batman for the most part.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like, I feel like in other superhero stuff, you don't really see the other characters like overshadow the hero. Like, I feel like Joker, like, that's pretty iconic. Like, they've done movies without Batman with Joker.
Yeah, they've done just Joker movies. Like, they wouldn't do, I mean, they did a Venom movie, but Venom is kind of part Spider-Man. But like, they wouldn't do like just a Green Goblin movie. And the villains in X-Men, I think, are some of the weaker parts. Like Mystique is interesting, Magneto's interesting. Past that, I'm kind of like,
well,
okay.
The First Class and Days of Future Past was more Magneto focused, which I thought was good. But I mean, they obviously had Xavier and the ensemble and stuff. It wasn't just Magneto.
Yeah, so far the TV show has done a lot of great stuff, but done characters more justice than the movies had, the Fox movies. But I still think Magneto and Professor X, for that matter, were more interesting in the movies than
I
in
agree.
the 90s show. The 90s show, Professor X is always just like, team, we have to do this.
Yeah.
Mental spasm, what's going on?
I honestly think that the more minor characters that sometimes get left out have way more time to shine in this series. Like, my favorite characters in this series are Rogue, Gambit, Beast. Like, those are 3 characters where, like, they don't even consider adding them most, like, every time. Like, sometimes Rogue she's usually in it, but, like, not exactly the right way.
In the first X-Men movie, she was like Rogue in name only. Like,
yeah,
she was nothing like I'm not saying that the 90s show is like the ultimate source material or anything.
To
but
me,
if we're
that's like
comparing,
perfect Rogue is. That's when I think of Rogue, I think of this show where she's like the sassy Southern girl.
Yeah.
Where she's like ultimate like feminism.
Femme fatale.
No, like feminism. So
Okay.
like she has sort of a femininity to her, but she also like can do things on her own. Like she could fly. She's way stronger. Like there's a scene where Wolverine, who's really strong, and Beast, who's really strong, were trying to hold up a door, and she comes along and she's like, "Hey fellas, I got it," and she like lifted it up way higher than the two of them
like
together.
No effort, yeah.
Yeah.
And she's really funny too.
She's really funny.
She like kicked some character off of another character, and the character was like, "Oh, thanks so much, Rogue," and Rogue was like, "I enjoyed it."
Yeah. She's just awesome.
Yeah.
And like Gambit usually gets left out, and Gambit is like one of my faves.
Gambit just barely made it into one of the movies.
That's what I want to see with it. Like, I'm hoping if they're doing a new cartoon series of X-Men, I'm hoping that the MCU will smarten up and like actually do like a good, like put a high budget X-Men out there, because that I would be like in my seat immediately. Like, because I've spent so much time on like Spider-Man and the Avengers and stuff. If they did like an X-Men trilogy, I'd be like, all right, we're going premiere night. I'm gonna dress up as Rogue. Like, I'm gonna got my popcorn and everything.
Absolutely.
And I want to see more of Beast. Like Kelsey Grammer as Beast, great choice.
Perfect choice.
Not
Loved
enough.
it.
Not enough of him.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited to see more.
I would rewatch X-Men 3 just to see Kelsey Grammer as Beast again.
Absolutely.
Or the last 30 seconds of Days of Future Past.
Or like, hey, even Storm. Like Storm is always in it, but she's always like so minor in the background.
Yeah.
It's like, come on, like she's super strong. She can control the weather, and she's second in command of the team. And she often goes out without Cyclops with like a group of people and like leads the team.
Yeah.
She's like awesome, and they just like have her in the background as like a teacher and just like teaching students, and it's like, no, she should go out in the field because she's so cool. And it's like, we don't see enough of her.
Her big line in the first X-Men movie was like, you know what happens when a toad gets struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else. It's like, wow, that was
good.
How many writers did it take to come up with that one?
It's like, okay, and if we're talking about like, you know, visual representation of like people of color, it's like we have an awesome black female superhero, and there's not like enough of them, and we're not using her to her fullest.
Yeah, and Jubilee, a cool Asian superhero.
Yeah,
who,
she's Chinese
like,
American.
Basically got like maybe a few minutes of screen time, and I want to say X-Men Apocalypse. Like, what is going on?
I don't even remember Jubilee being in that movie.
She had a yellow coat on. That's how you knew she was Jubilee.
Oh my goodness. That's how much like it affected me that she was in it. And it's like Jubilee's pretty prominent. Like the pilot of the X-Men show is about like
Jubilee,
her joining the team.
Yeah.
And she's kind of like a little bit of comic relief, and she has like an affinity for Wolverine, which is nice because a lot of people are like off put by Wolverine because he's, you know, he's a little grumpy mole man, and she's like,
did you just say he's a grumpy mole man?
Old man.
Okay, well, I guess in terms of years, but
yes,
okay. He doesn't have old man energy.
Well, he's had it.
He's had it.
He doesn't really care about formality. He's like, I've seen it all, kind of thing. And there was one episode where she was like with like Colossus or something like that, and she's like, I want to team up with Wolverine. Him and I together are great, or something like that. And it's like, oh, this is so sweet that she probably like sees him as like a father figure. And it's like, where's the Jubilee Wolverine like side story where they're like go on a road trip together or
Yeah.
something. I want to see that.
Instead, it's Wolverine and Rogue in the first movie, and they're like,
It's like whatever.
it's okay,
Yeah.
I guess.
And the Wolverine Jean stuff is always kind of a bit boring to me.
Yeah.
In the
Gene crying over the picture.
Yeah, in the cartoon, he's always like, Gene.
He always says it in such a weird voice.
Such an emo
Gene.
thing. It's like, Gene's not that special. Who cares?
Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts about the jazz singer and or Rebecca and or Superman?
I
Batman?
have final thoughts about none of those.
Well, Rebecca was good. Let's.
Oh, Rebecca was great.
Yeah.
If you're gonna see any of these, see Rebecca. That's definitely worth it. And it gets you hyped for old cinema. You see that movie and you're like, ooh, that is a good movie. That actually kind of stands the test of time. Whereas some of these other movies, I'm like, no, we
Not
don't
so
need
much.
to see that. I've been watching some old movies without you, some of the ones that I think you might be less interested in. And we just have so much to get through this year.
Mhm.
When you were out of town, I watched a bunch of old movies. I watched Charade. I watched Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And I watched The 7-Year Itch because I hadn't seen a Marilyn Monroe movie. And I'm like,
Marilyn Monroe.
what's she all about? And she's funny. I think people always talk about like how she's like so stunning and she's like, you know, this figure of beauty. Whereas like she's funny. Like she has some good gags, and I think people don't give her enough credit when they talk about her now from the past.
Do we have a Marilyn Monroe movie on our list? It's like Some Like It Hot.
Some Like It Hot.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that because that's supposed to be one of her more famous ones. I watched 2 of her other famous ones, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and she was quite funny in that.
Mhm.
And then The 7-Year Itch. That movie is like mediocre at best, but she is the best part of that movie. And if you were to just see like her scenes, you'd be like, oh, she's great. She's hilarious. She like carries that movie on her back.
Well, rock on.
Charade is a cute movie. It's like a cute rom-com mystery movie. Definitely worth a watch. It's like not the best movie ever, but it's fun. And it's worth a watch, I think.
Mhm.
And Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, that might be on my top 30.
You were raving about that.
I was like, maybe some people don't like it, whatever. I see why maybe you're not into it, but I think it's so well crafted in terms of storytelling that you're like full of anxiety, like in the best way. You're like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? Like it engages you, and it's like creepy, and it's so well done. And it made me so hyped about watching movies. And I was like, okay, this is from the 60s. Like, I'm so excited to see other movies that I haven't seen before from that time period. It's like, wow, we can actually do a lot here. And it's great. If you haven't seen it, go watch it.
Yeah, now I want to watch it, but
Yeah.
maybe I'll have to wait until you're out of town or something. To throw it on.
I'd be willing to watch it maybe around like spooky season.
Okay.
It's so good that I would rewatch it like less than a year out, which I don't usually rewatch movies that soon.
Right. For the podcast, would you want to rewatch it?
Yeah, maybe I would talk about it again. It's good. I would definitely watch it again.
Right on. All right. Well, look forward to our next episode where we'll be moving on to The Passion of Joan of Arc, and cross your fingers that we get our friend Gabe on that episode.
Yeah,
I think it'll
absolutely.
be pretty cool. All right. Take care.
Take care.